The Cuban dictatorship tries to spread terror with a decrepit arsenal precisely at the moment when the United States tightens its grip on Havana. And this Tuesday, May 26, 2026, the regime shows up shouting about resistance while the numbers show an old, small, and propaganda-dependent military force. The combative rhetoric comes from the communist leadership, goes through Castro saying that Raul Castro will not be taken alive, and reaches the regime's actions as an attempt to intimidate Washington and keep its own population in line through fear. But the real structure is fragile. About 49,000 active military personnel, 39,000 reservists, Soviet defense systems, few combat aircraft, limited helicopters, and an armed force, which serves more to control the Cuban people than to face a power like the United States. While drones and intelligence aircraft monitor bases, radars, runways, and military centers on the island, Havana tries to respond with bravado, but ends up showing the image of a cornered dictatorship, displaying military junk as if it were a wartime shield. What can this regime still manage to field? Why did the Castro family turn legal and military fear into a public threat? How does a dictatorship without a real air force, without a strong economy, and without enough energy intend to sustain a military response against Trump? I'll tell you all about that in a moment. If you like this kind of straightforward, no-nonsense content, consider subscribing because we have videos like this every day. The center of the crisis is in Cuba, but the pressure is coming from Washington. The Trump administration tightened the siege after Raul Castro was indicted in the United States, accused of crimes related to the downing of 2 civilian planes in 1996. The regime's response came with a tone of war. Miguel Diaz-Canel called the accusation a political maneuver to justify military aggression. Meanwhile, Mariela Castro appeared at a rally in Havana, saying that the country was calm, that no one would kidnap him, and that he would die fighting. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba are made up of the Revolutionary Army, the Revolutionary Navy, the Air Defense and Revolutionary Air Force, as well as territorial militias and auxiliary structures. On paper, there is an organized military machine to defend the island. In practice, the available data indicates about 49,000 active military personnel and 39,000 reservists, totaling approximately 88,000 people who can be mobilized. It may seem like a lot for internal propaganda, but it's not much when it comes to facing a military power that has aircraft carriers, carrier-based aviation, satellites, drones, electronic intelligence, and bases. The Cuban army is still the most important arm of the regime. It concentrates most of the military personnel and serves both for defense and for internal control. This is the difference that needs to be understood. The regime doesn't maintain soldiers solely for a war against a foreign force. The military must patrol streets, control protests, guard Communist Party sites, and stop social crises from becoming revolts. Amid blackouts, shortages, and people fleeing, Cuban soldiers serve as revolutionaries, as a show of force abroad and as an instrument of pressure at home. The Cuban arsenal mentioned in recent assessments appears to be based on old equipment, much of it inherited from the Soviet era. That's where propaganda starts to clash with reality. The Cuban Air Force is the weakest point of the military showcase. The survey mentioned in the news points to a small fleet of aircraft with around 5 fighter jets plus reconnaissance planes and other capabilities. That would raise the approximate number to 9 aircraft. In terms of helicopters, there are 4 attack helicopters and about 7 multipurpose ones, totaling around 20 aircraft overall. For a dictatorship that talks about confronting the United States, that number is shocking. 20 aircraft. They can't even sustain a prolonged defense against a modern force, especially when the adversary is able to map out radars, bases, runways, and reaction patterns. The Cuban Navy also doesn't appear to be a decisive threat. The regime may have patrol boats, coastal assets, and infrastructure for close defense, but it doesn't have a fleet capable of competing with the United States in the Caribbean. The real function is to protect coastal areas, monitor internal air movements, support regime operations, and try to maintain some presence around the island. In a serious crisis, the Cuban Navy would rely more on hiding, dispersing, and resisting than on directly confronting an American naval force. That's why the war rhetoric sounds heavy, but the military inventory shows limited capability. The news reports a harsh siege focused on surveillance, with over 175 hours of manned and drone flights around Cuba to monitor air and naval bases and other targets. Intelligence efforts focus on dangerous defense structures. This surveillance isn't just for watching. It's used to understand how the regime reacts, which radars are turned on, how communications behave, which areas are protected, and which structures actually work. The regime knows this. That's why they try to respond with combative rhetoric. Diaz-Canel tried to complete the act by accusing Washington of creating a justification for military aggression. This response shows the regime's fear that the case against Raul Castro could turn into something bigger. The dictatorship knows that a formal accusation in the United States is not just paperwork. It can pave the way for sanctions, arrests, blockades, diplomatic pressure, isolation of allies, and new actions against military and business structures controlled by the Cuban armed forces. When Marco Rubio says that Cuba is a national security threat because of its ties with China and Russia, the message stops being symbolic and enters the strategic realm. The regime also tries to sell the idea of irregular warfare, as if it could make up for the lack of air and naval power with popular resistance. This is an old Cuban doctrine, spreading defense throughout the territory, mobilizing militias, and turning the island into a difficult environment for any foreign force. But today this faces another problem. Modern irregular warfare depends on communication, drones, energy, mobility, technology, fuel, and coordination. Cuba suffers from blackouts, resource shortages, and a deep economic crisis. A regime that can barely keep the lights on in the average citizen's home would have difficulty sustaining an organized military response for very long. American pressure also targets the military-economic heart of the dictatorship. The Cuban armed forces are not just soldiers and barracks. They control companies, hotels, logistics, trade, hard currency, and strategic sectors through structures linked to the military apparatus. When Washington sanctions companies controlled by the Cuban military, it hits the elite in the wallet who keep the regime standing. The regime is not just concerned with troops, it's concerned with money, with control. Meanwhile, the US military presence in the region increases psychological pressure, and every statement by Trump forces the regime to react. And each reaction exposes the difference between revolutionary rhetoric and real capability. What happens now depends on Washington's next decision and Havana's reaction. If the Trump administration maintains the legal, military, and economic siege, the dictatorship is likely to increase public events, resistance rhetoric, and national defense propaganda. They may display troops, show old weapons, call on communist youth, and talk about fighting to try to shore up its domestic support base. But the most sensitive part lies elsewhere. If the United States moves against military networks, regime companies, or Raul Castro's allies, the dictatorship will have to choose between surrendering in a negotiation for survival or doubling down. With warlike rhetoric that its own arsenal can't back up, I'm Milson Alves, global internationalist, and my purpose is to keep you truthfully informed every day. The news links are in the video description. Like this video, subscribe, and check the comments at the end to stay engaged with the Milson Alves community.